My name is Timothy, and I was a secondary school lesson teacher. Teaching had always been more than just a job for me, it was my passion. Helping students understand difficult concepts gave me a sense of fulfillment. Though I wasn't rich, I managed to survive by offering private lessons after school. Some students were eager to learn, while others attended only because their parents forced them. Regardless, I always gave my best. But life had bigger plans for me. My elder brother, who had been living abroad, had promised to bring me over. Just be patient, Tim. In 3 months, you'll be here with me, he assured me. That promise was all I needed to hold on to. With 3 months left before my departure, I continued teaching to save as much money as possible. Among my students, one stood out, Nancy. She was bright and determined, yet she struggled with some subjects. I made it my mission to help her succeed. Every day after school at 3 o'clock, she met me at a small location near the school where I held private lessons. For 2 hours, we worked on her weak areas before she went home. But that Wednesday, something changed. I arrived at our usual spot, expecting to see her waiting, but she wasn't there. I checked my watch. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Still, no sign of Nancy. I pulled out my phone, expecting a message, but there was nothing. It was unlike her to miss a lesson without informing me. Maybe something urgent had come up. Maybe she had simply forgotten. Either way, I wasn't going to wait forever. With the scorching sun beating down on me, I decided to leave. My mind drifted to the future as I walked home. I imagined myself in a foreign country, earning good money, living a better life. It was a dream I had held onto for years, and now it was within reach. But unknown to me, my life was about to take a turn I never saw coming. By the time I got home, exhaustion weighed on me. I tossed my bag onto the couch, loosened my shirt, and went straight to the kitchen. I needed something strong to ease the stress of the day. From the cabinet, I pulled out a bottle of alcohol, poured myself a glass, and took a long sip. The burn in my throat was comforting. I took another sip, leaned back against the chair, and let out a deep breath. Just as I began to relax, a sudden knock on the door startled me. I frowned. It was 6 o'clock. Who could be visiting me at this hour? Curious, I set my glass down and walked to the door. When I opened it, I was surprised to see Nancy standing there in her school uniform, her usual bright smile on her face. Nancy. I blinked. What are you doing here? She looked up at me, eyes innocent. I'm sorry, sir. I couldn't make it earlier. Can we have the lesson now? I hesitated. It was already late, and after drinking, I wasn't in the right state of mind to teach. But before I could insist she leave, my gaze drifted to her uniform. Her skirt seemed shorter than usual, revealing more of her thighs. I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes away. Nancy, it's late. You should go home. But sir, I really need your help. I don't want to fail my exams. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. I knew I should have shut the door. I knew I should have insisted she leave. But I hesitated, and that was my mistake. Just for a little while, she added, stepping closer. My heart pounded. Something about the way she looked at me made my pulse race. I inhaled sharply, trying to suppress the sudden rush of emotions. All right, I finally said. But just for a short time. She smiled and walked past me into the room. As I shut the door behind her, unease settled in my chest. I expected her to take her usual seat, but instead, she stood there, eyeing me curiously. You drink? She asked, glancing at the glass on the table. I scratched my head, feeling exposed. Just a little. It helps me relax after a long day. She giggled. I didn't know teachers drank too. I forced a chuckle. Teachers are human too, Nancy. She moved closer, her eyes studying me. Sir, you look different when you're not in school. My throat went dry. Nancy, let's focus on your lesson, I said firmly. She nodded but kept glancing at me. I opened the book, trying to concentrate, but my mind was scattered. Minutes passed, and I struggled to process my own words. Then, as if sensing my discomfort, she leaned forward slightly. Sir, are you okay? I exhaled. Yeah, I'm fine. She tilted her head. You seem nervous. I'm not, I replied quickly. She smiled knowingly. You are. I swallowed again. Nancy, just focus on the lesson. But she didn't move immediately. Instead, she reached for her pen, her fingers brushing against mine. It was a small touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine. And in that moment, I knew I was losing control. Stepped into the house, and her presence hit me like a wave, raw and electric. I recognized it immediately: lust. It was an unwelcome, overpowering force that I tried to suppress, but the harder I fought, the more it consumed me. Clenching my fists, I forced myself to focus on the reason she was here: tutoring. Nothing more. She placed her books on the table and smiled, her voice smooth and teasing. I hope I'm not late, she said. I cleared my throat, struggling to sound composed. No, you're on time. She sat beside me, her perfume, sweet and intoxicating, filling the air. My eyes drifted toward her despite my efforts to stay focused on the textbook. After a moment, she glanced up, pouting slightly. I'm really thirsty, she said. Could you get me something to drink? I stood immediately, asking, water or juice? She hesitated, then flashed a mischievous smile. Actually, do you have alcohol? I frowned. Alcohol? You drink? She shrugged. Not often. But it helps me concentrate better. I shook my head. No way. I'm not giving you alcohol. She leaned closer, her eyes locking with mine. Please. Just a little. It helps me understand things faster. Reluctantly, I poured her a small glass of whiskey, handing it over with a sigh. She smiled, took a sip, and sighed contentedly. Ah, perfect. We tried to study, but her focus was slipping. I pointed at a page in her book, explaining a concept, but she giggled. You're talking too fast, she said, her words slightly slurred. Slow down. I frowned. I'm not talking fast. You're just not paying attention. She leaned closer, her breath warm. Maybe I need more to drink. I groaned. You're supposed to be learning, not drinking. Before I could stop her, she poured another glass and took a long sip. I sighed, realizing we were past the point of no return. The room felt heavier, the air thicker, as the alcohol took its toll. Minutes passed, and I grew lightheaded. She smiled to herself, tracing the rim of her glass. What are you smiling about? I asked. She shrugged. Nothing. Just thinking. Thinking about what? She turned to me, her eyes dark and unreadable. About you. My breath caught. Me. She nodded, biting her lip. You're kind of cute when you're serious. I laughed nervously. You're drunk. She smirked. Maybe. But that doesn't mean I'm lying. Her hand brushed my arm, sending a jolt through me. Do you have a girlfriend? She asked. I hesitated. Why are you asking? She smiled. Just curious. I exhaled. No, I don't. Her grin widened. Interesting. Her fingers traced patterns on my arm, her gaze unwavering. The room felt warmer, the tension unbearable. She leaned closer, her breath warm against my cheek. You've been staring at me all night, she murmured. I chuckled nervously. Have I? She nodded. Yeah. Do you like what you see? I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Her eyes held mine, and I felt myself losing control. Then, without warning, she stood and walked over to me. Before I could react, she sat on my lap, her hands resting on my shoulders. I froze, my mind blank. What are you doing? I stammered. She leaned in, her lips inches from mine. Shish, she whispered. Just go with it. My heart raced, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I knew I should push her away, tell her this was wrong, but I couldn't move. Her eyes held me captive, and I felt myself giving in. The line between right and wrong blurred, and I realized I no longer had control. In that moment, the enemy, my own weakness, destroyed my future. The moment she sat on my lap, something inside me tensed. The alcohol had dulled my senses, making everything feel hazy, but somewhere deep inside, I knew this wasn't right. A wave of realization crashed over me, pushing through the fog in my mind. Get up, I said, my voice firmer than before. She looked at me, confused, tilting her head slightly. What? I said. Get up, I repeated, my tone sharper now. Her playful smirk faded, and she slowly rose to her feet. Without another word, she walked toward the bed and lay down. She let out a deep sigh, closing her eyes as exhaustion overtook her. Within moments, her breathing became steady, she had fallen asleep. I sat there, staring at her, my heart still pounding. Not from desire, but from the battle raging within me. My mind told me to step away, to leave the room, but I felt paralyzed. I had let things get too far, and now, guilt weighed heavily on my chest. I exhaled deeply, running a hand over my face. I needed to regain control of myself. This wasn't who I was. I had a future ahead of me, one that could be destroyed in a single reckless moment. Taking one last look at her sleeping form, I knew I was losing the battle. I then approached her and then I began to touch her. I couldn't control myself as I ended up sleeping with her. A few hours later, I woke to an eerie silence. Something felt off. I sat up, blinking in the dim light of the bedside lamp. A strange sense of unease crept over me. I glanced at the clock. It was past 10 at night. Turning my head toward the bed, I expected to see her shifting in her sleep. But she was completely still. Nancy. I called softly. Are you awake? No response. I stood up, my stomach twisting. Hey, it's late. You should get going. Still nothing. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer. Come on, stop playing around. Silence. A lump formed in my throat as I reached out and lightly shook her shoulder. Nancy. She didn't stir. My heart pounded against my ribs as I pressed two fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. My hands trembled so badly I could barely focus. I leaned in, listening for a heartbeat. Nothing. Panic surged through me. My breath hitched as I shook her harder. Nancy, wake up. My voice cracked. This isn't funny. Still no movement. Still no breath. A cold sweat broke over my skin as reality sank in. My legs felt weak, my chest tight. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Could she be dead? A chilling fear gripped me as I tapped Nancy's arm, my fingers trembling against her lifeless skin. Nancy, I whispered, my voice cracking under the weight of panic. She didn't stir. My chest tightened, my breath shallow and erratic. A cold sweat broke over my forehead as I pressed my fingers to her wrist, desperate to feel a pulse. Nothing. My mind refused to accept the reality before me. She was fine just moments ago. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, my thoughts spiraling into chaos. No, 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 I muttered, shaking her shoulders harder, my voice rising in desperation. But still, she didn't move. A violent shiver ran down my spine, and suddenly, my own body betrayed me. A sharp pain stabbed through my chest, forcing me to clutch at my shirt. My breath came in short gasps, my vision darkening at the edges. My legs buckled, and I collapsed onto the cold floor, struggling for air. The room spun wildly, shapes and shadows blurring together. My heartbeat grew unsteady, erratic, and uncontrolled. I tried to call out, but my voice barely escaped my lips. A sudden jolt brought me back to consciousness, my body drenched in sweat. My lungs expanded sharply, sucking in air as if I had been drowning. My pulse still pounded, my hands clammy as I ran them over my face. The dim glow of my bedside lamp cast familiar shadows, grounding me back to reality. I sat up quickly, my head spinning as I frantically patted the space beside me. Empty. My gaze darted around the room. Nothing was out of place. My books, the glass on the table, the air itself, all still, untouched. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. It was a dream. A horrifying, bone-chilling dream. I exhaled shakily, my hands gripping the bedsheet as I tried to steady myself. Never in my life had a dream felt so real, so suffocating. My body still bore the weight of the terror, the feeling of Nancy's lifelessness imprinted on my hands. I swallowed hard and glanced at the time. It was just past 5 in the evening. Relief crashed over me like a wave, but the fear lingered. My dream wasn't just a random nightmare. It felt like a warning. A message. Something dark, something dangerous had almost consumed me. I leaned back, whispering under my breath, "Thank you, God." Just as my heartbeat began to steady, a sudden knock echoed through the silent room. My entire body stiffened. The sound was sharp, deliberate, cutting through the quiet like a blade. My breath caught in my throat as I turned my gaze toward the door. Another knock followed, this time louder. My palms grew damp as I hesitated before standing up. My legs still trembled from the weight of my nightmare, but I forced myself forward. Every step toward the door felt agonizingly slow. I took a deep breath, my fingers hovering over the handle before finally pulling it open. And there she was. Nancy stood in the doorway, her school bag slung over her shoulder, her uniform slightly wrinkled. "Good evening, sir. I came for our lesson." A cold wave of fear crashed over me, paralyzing me where I stood. My nightmare replayed in my mind in vivid detail, each moment of terror rushing back with force. Nancy, my voice wavered, my decision crystallizing in that instant. I think you should go home. Confusion flickered across her face. But why? I shook my head, stepping back slightly. I can't tutor you anymore. You won't be coming here again. Her brows furrowed. Did I do something wrong? No, I said quickly. But this. It's not right. Nancy stared at me, her expression shifting from confusion to disappointment. Sir, you always help me. I still need your lessons. I exhaled, gripping the doorframe. You'll be fine, Nancy. You're smart. You'll find another tutor. She hesitated, searching my face for an answer I couldn't give. After a long pause, she nodded, her voice softer. Are you sure? Yes. My voice was firm, final. Go home, Nancy. Take care of yourself. She lingered for a moment, as if waiting for me to change my mind. But when I didn't, she sighed and turned away. I watched her disappear down the street, my pulse still unsteady. Only when she was gone did I finally exhale, closing the door with a deep sense of relief. 3 months later, my brother kept his promise. I left the country and built a new life, one where I owned my own school, free from the shadows of my past. I often thought back to that evening, to the warning that came in the form of a nightmare. Imagine what could have happened if I had ignored it. If I had allowed temptation to take control that night. I shuddered at the thought. The fear of murder was 10 times stronger than the fear of lust. That night, the enemy had set a trap for me, but I had seen it before it was too late. Standing in the silence of my new home, I whispered once more, "Thank you, God." I had been given a second chance. And I would never take it for granted. The end.